Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and today's video is going to be all about enlightenment. Specifically, what is enlightenment? What are some of the misconceptions about enlightenment? So more exactly, what isn't enlightenment? And I'm also going to be touching upon what somebody who presumes to be enlightened but really isn't, or isn't as enlightened as they believe they are, how they might present themselves based on how they're expected to act as an enlightened person based on this false idea of enlightenment, and what an enlightened way of being might actually look like in contrast to that. So that's what I'll be discussing today. So first of all, we need some definitions. What is enlightenment? It's something that gets spoken about a lot on the spiritual path. It's the very goal of the spiritual path. This great attainment known as enlightenment, sometimes referred to as awakening or being fully awakened. But what is it really? Because it's something that everybody wants to do on the spiritual path. It's something everybody wants to reach, but not many people can actually define it. So the concept of enlightenment has become quite generalized, but it actually comes from Buddhism, or to be more exact, it's an English word which has been used to translate a term within Buddhism, which is essentially about awakening from ignorance. So first of all, what does the word enlightenment mean in the English context? And then what is the Buddhist concept? And that might start to give us a kind of a rough idea of what enlightenment is supposed to look like. So if you think about the Enlightenment era in modern history, it's all about having knowledge, and how knowledge banishes ignorance, and it's all about having agency over life as a result of having that knowledge and being free from ignorance. So we might consider enlightenment in that way, and the implication is that when a person is enlightened, it will allow them to behave in a more sophisticated way and a more moral way, because we're rational beings and we can identify the problems with our own way of being using knowledge and correct that. So that, roughly speaking, would be the modern idea of enlightenment from a kind of rationalist, secular perspective. In terms of the Buddhist idea of enlightenment, which is really what we're talking about, it's the spiritual enlightenment. It's basically something similar but in the spiritual domain. Freedom from ignorance, specifically freedom from the ego, and being able to see outside of the limited frame that the ego traps us within, seeing things from its point of view, being able to rise above that and see things from a more objective, conscious point of view. So we have awakening from a state of ignorance, and we have the overcoming of hindrances and fetters, which are pretty much vices in the Western context. So that, roughly speaking, is what enlightenment is. Some people have a misconception that enlightenment equals reaching a particular state of consciousness. That's not what enlightenment is. So, for example, within Buddhism, you've got the various jhana states, spiritual states that a person can attain. And then, of course, in the yogic schools, you've got, for example, in Raja Yoga, you've got the different limbs of Raja Yoga that you can attain, culminating in samadhi. And there's a few different levels, well, really two agreed upon levels of samadhi. These are very lofty spiritual states, but just because a person reaches this state does not necessarily mean they have reached enlightenment. So that needs to be separated out. I have experienced samadhi states before, which I spoke about in some of my very first videos, and I'm definitely not enlightened. There's still some very big challenges in my own psyche that come from the ego that I need to overcome. So just because I attained a certain state does not necessarily mean that I'm then enlightened. It takes more than a single experience of God or of pure consciousness to reach that state of enlightenment. it takes a lot of work and a lot of experience to emerge into that state of being. So we have kind of a broad understanding of what enlightenment is, but in terms of what that really looks like more specifically, we really only have a caricature of what an enlightened person might look like. And it's the first thing that people think of when they think of an enlightened person. I'm talking about the idea of the person who's sort of just blissed out all the time, who's just calm and relaxed all the time, who is totally unconcerned with anything in the world, probably lives in a cave or a monastery somewhere, and is just, high up above it all, and is constantly in some kind of, advanced spiritual state of consciousness. And, if they do interact with people, they have like a force field around them that means that they just don't react to anything. They're completely non-reactive. So, like a person who has lost sensation in a limb would be non-reactive, but in an emotional sort of a sense. And so that is the stereotype that people have about an enlightened person. And so because this is the common misconception about what enlightenment looks like, when people are claiming to be enlightened or pretending to be fully enlightened, they often try and embody this kind of caricature of an enlightened person in a really performative way. Quite often, when they're behind closed doors and they're not putting on the performance, things change and they're just like the average person. But sometimes people really do kind of adopt this kind of way of being in an attempt to kind of become enlightened. And in those cases, what you'll find is that, at least this is my observation, is that in order to permanently or more or less permanently be in that kind of a state of being, you have to actually extract yourself from any of the external circumstances that would trigger your ego and actually cause you to react and disturb your peace, so that you can remain in that peaceful state, undisturbed. The people that I know of who either claim to be fully awakened or present themselves as though they are without saying it, they all kind of have a few things in common. They don't have to go into work every day because either they're retired or something like that. And so there's not the kind of constant stress and worry that comes with the situations one finds oneself in at work that can be quite difficult. Somebody who hasn't been in a workplace environment in a very long time, they don't have to pay rent or pay a mortgage. And if they do, they always have, a support network of devoted followers who can do it for them if they run into trouble. They don't really have any serious health problems, although they're not necessarily healthy. And they don't have these serious health problems, mental or physical, because they live in a very low stress environment. They don't have a lot of close family that they have to deal with and constantly have to interact with difficult people in their own family. They often don't really travel much, and if they do, it'll always be somebody else driving them. So there's never any opportunity for them to experience road rage because they're not in the driver's seat, or get stressed out about being stuck in traffic. So at every point, all of the stresses, all of the things that would drag a person back into responding from ego and reacting from ego are not present in that person's life. And so thinking about these scenarios that these fully awakened masters find themselves in, I couldn't help but notice that they're not actually challenging themselves to overcome all of those fetters and overcome all of those personal weaknesses in order to rise above them and become something more enlightened. They're not actually going through the process. They are simply removing themselves from anything that will cause them to react in that way. But of course, if you were truly enlightened, you wouldn't have to resort to being removed from a situation like that, because you would have cultivated a more intelligent way of responding to those everyday situations. So it actually calls into question just how enlightened these people really are. And it calls into question whether there's any real truth to the stereotype of the enlightened person. And I was talking about this with my wife recently, as I've been thinking about it the last week or so, and these sort of individuals who are completely insulated from the everyday troubles of the world, who then claim to be fully awakened. And she came up with a metaphor, which I'm now appropriating. Imagine there was a person who claimed that they were the greatest skydiver in all of human history, that they were unparalleled in their skill and their prowess as a skydiver. Now imagine that person had never actually engaged in the act of skydiving, or perhaps they have once or twice, and it was many, many years ago, and there's no way of actually measuring their skill level against anyone else who's a skydiver. But this person, just imagine this person making this claim. They have developed this sense of self in them based on how they think that they would skydive and how much they think about skydiving, and reached the conclusion that they must then be the greatest skydiver that ever lived. But what would happen if that person went up into a plane? Perhaps they're afraid of heights. Perhaps when they find themselves at the precipice and they have to jump out of the plane, perhaps there's a little tinge of fear that they weren't expecting. Perhaps they worry about whether they will be able to operate the parachute. Perhaps when they jump out, they're actually overcome with how daunting it is to be just falling through the air with a great amount of uncertainty as to your fate. And all of these things would indicate that the person, once tested, really is not that good of a skydiver, but is really quite amateur. So how many people who claim to have reached this enlightened state of consciousness are actually truly tested in their enlightenment? And what would that testing look like? Well, it would look like, actually being involved in the world and having to talk to real people and having to, have the possibility of difficulties in life. And when we're talking about this process of enlightenment, we're talking about overcoming fetters or hindrances. So what does that mean? What's the implication there? That there needs to be the fetter, there needs to be the hindrance there that we experience before we can overcome it. And then the process of enlightenment becomes confronting the fetter, confronting the hindrance, and a struggle to kind of overcome that in a way that engages the consciousness rather than the ego. Not just running away from the problem, because then we learn nothing of how to overcome anything. So it's really a false form of enlightenment. And I'm not saying that any person who, is involved in a kind of monastic life or lives a hermit type existence is necessarily unenlightened. That certainly has a place in terms of, it can be advantageous to go deeper into, experiencing God's presence if you can remove all of those other distractions as much as possible and to have an opportunity to live a life where you can do that. But I think that there has to be more to that than just an escape from the everyday world. Because what does the enlightened person need to escape from? They've overcome all of these things. And in addition to that, most of us will never be in a position where we can just drop out of society and live this kind of a lifestyle. So what about the enlightened person then who, because there's nothing to say that someone who is enlightened can't be in any walk of life. So then what would it look like if an enlightened person was in fact enlightened but was still stuck in the everyday world? Well, the first thing, building upon everything I've said thus far, is that they would accept their situation and accept the reality of it rather than trying to run away from it as the first step in dealing with that situation wisely. And that really is the second aspect of how an enlightened person who is in the world might look. They will be in a mundane situation, but the way that they deal with that situation will be dealt with differently to other people in a wise way, in a skillful way, in a conscious way. So what does this mean in practice? It means not reacting to things in the same way as other people. So, for example, if it's a workplace setting, maybe this person is in a workplace where there's a lot of people who gossip. There's a lot of cliquiness, there's a lot of office politics, there's a lot of conflict that goes on between people, personality clashes. How would a conscious, awakened person deal with this? Would they be dragged into the drama and participate in the gossip and participate in the kind of conflict with other members of the workplace over really petty things? Or if they do find that there's a point of tension with other people, would they try and think of a way of restoring that relationship and think of a way of bringing harmony to that situation by appealing to everybody's better nature? And, you know, in a way that benefits everyone, not getting hung up on, oh, this person did this to me, so I need to get back at them, but actually thinking of a way of restoring a harmonious kind of environment. That would be a sign of a person who has a degree of enlightenment. It's not to say that the other people in that environment would be receptive to that attempt to kind of resolve things in an enlightened way, because the majority of people are very stuck in their ego, and they are very stuck in really negative ways of behaving with other people, unfortunately. But at least there's an attempt to do things differently. And if nobody else chooses to take that opportunity to change their behavior, to evolve in their own way of being, then at the very least you've taught yourself something about how you can behave differently in that kind of a setting. And so we can bring consciousness to everyday situations in that kind of a way. And similarly, a person who is enlightened might see the value of being in a conscious state and look for other ways of reinforcing that conscious state in their everyday life. So if there are opportunities where the person, there's little gaps in the day where the person isn't doing anything, you know, perhaps they're sitting on a bus, or perhaps they're taking a break and they're doing something where they would normally just be scrolling through their social media feed. What if instead of doing that, the person took the time to be present and really enjoy the presence of the moment and really take the time to separate themselves from all of the kind of things that are happening around them, so that, you know, their consciousness can be still, can be just a point of stillness in the eye of the storm, and just enjoying the peace of that. It doesn't have to be a full meditation, but how many of us call ourselves back to conscious awareness throughout the day? How many of us get distracted by other things? A conscious person or an awakened or enlightened person might make a habit of getting back into that state of consciousness as much as possible, bringing themselves back to the center. But that's not to say that they're always going to be just super conscious and super aware of the present moment at all times. And I think this is perhaps another misconception of what it's like to be fully enlightened. Because, you know, some of my teachers from the past now, who I now realize were wrong, made out like if you are an awakened person, then you can go to work and you can remain awake and fully conscious in your job while you work. And I tried this, and it might be true if you're doing a really menial task, like, I don't know, drawing water from a well, or gardening, or stacking shelves at a shopping centre, which was one of my first jobs, and still to this day probably one of my favourite, because it meant that I could just occupy my physical body with something really repetitive so that I could just go within. But most jobs are not like that these days. You've got, constant demands on you. Answer this email, answer this Teams call, answer this meeting invite, go to this meeting, do this task, now do that task. Now, this person's coming to your desk and asking you something. Now this person's calling you on the phone. And it's really scattered, and it's really chaotic, and it's really disordered, and it's just completely frantic. Helter-skelter, as it were. That's the state of the modern workplace. And so it's actually a type of insanity. And it's actually a type of dysfunction to go through the world like that. It's important to recognize that this very modern way of being is inherently dysfunctional and unnatural for human beings. But here's the thing: if you want to keep your job, and if you want things to continue to run smoothly, you have to participate in that system. And the only way that you can do that is by behaving in a way that is compatible with that system, which is a way that is delusional and is a way that is dysfunctional. So you see the problem there. It's not possible to be conscious in that situation. Sometimes we have to accept that there are periods of light and there are periods of dark. There are periods where we can be awake and we can be conscious, and there's other periods where the darkness just envelops us. The darkness and the ignorance of the everyday world just completely envelops us. And we just have to navigate those times. And what about this idea that a fully enlightened or a fully awakened person is completely non-reactive, like I mentioned earlier? Would this be reflected in how a fully enlightened person would respond in an environment where they really were challenged by these difficult situations? And I think it depends on what you mean by non-reactive. You can be non-reactive in the sense of not having a knee-jerk reaction to something, but still responding to something, but doing it in a more measured and conscious way. I think in that sense a person can be non-reactive. But in this misconception of what it means to be enlightened, people think of non-reactivity as just being completely passive. Like, if a person punches you or shouts at you or crosses a line with you, then you just take it and you just, namaste, and you thank them for abusing you and you don't do anything about it. And I think that's completely wrong as well. And I don't think that is how an enlightened person would behave. Because if you truly are free from ignorance, you will recognize that, you need to do certain things to preserve your ability to function in the world so that you can go on another day, to devote as much time as you can and have the most advantageous position possible to be able to devote yourself to God and to spirituality. And that is not compatible with just being a doormat for everybody, because then you're not living a life that is centered on your own conscious awareness, but on the whims and the demands of other people's egos and their desire to take advantage of people. And so you're actually creating karma for them by allowing them to cross a line with you. So a truly enlightened person in an everyday situation would be good at enforcing their boundaries in an assertive way, not in a way where they fly off the handle. And so that is another thing that challenges these misconceptions about enlightenment. And I think potentially there would be situations where an enlightened person would go beyond being just assertive and in fact have a bit of aggression in their demeanor in certain situations where innocent people are being harmed, or there's a serious danger to other people that is presented. And the only way to minimize that is by using force against a particularly wicked person, say a terrorist, for example. And that is potentially compatible with an enlightened way of being as well. Of course, an enlightened person would be reluctant to ever resort to that, but there would be situations where it's still necessary. And I'd like to finish with what I see as perhaps another misconception that people have about enlightenment, and that is the idea that it is actually possible to be fully awakened or fully enlightened in this life. And the reason I think that that is a bit of a misconception is because, we might be completely free from the ego, but we still live in a world of imperfection because we still live as individual beings with eyes that can only see so far and ears that can only hear so far. And so every perception that we have by virtue of these faculties is inherently false, it's inherently ignorant, and it's inherently illusory because it doesn't see the full picture. And there is a perception of division rather than wholeness. And it is that state of being from which the ego arises, from which the impressions that form into an ego complex arise. And we cannot exist in any state other than that. So long as we're alive, it'll keep coming back. The potential for egoic consciousness to emerge will always be there latent, just because of the fact that we exist as individuals like this. And so the only way to be fully perfected, I would argue, in a literal sense of the word, would be if we were able to open a wormhole to an antimatter universe where we met our exact double and we annihilated with our exact double down to every individual particle, so that there was nothing left except for pure energy. In that situation, you might be able to say, I've reached a state of perfection. But anything short of that and any such claim is false. And so the final kind of piece to someone who is enlightened is so-called, is the fact that they will acknowledge their own imperfection, and in a kind of paradoxical way, they will be humble enough to acknowledge the incompleteness of their own enlightenment, and acknowledging that although they have overcome all of these fetters, and although they have overcome all of these desires of the ego, the work is never finished, and there's always something more to learn. And so the moment somebody says they've finished the path, you know that they have fallen off the horse, because there is no end. So long as we exist in this state, it requires constant diligence to remain in a state of relative enlightenment and relative awakening. So that would be my final kind of point about misconceptions to do with enlightenment. And hopefully me talking through this has helped people to understand the concept a bit more, at least from my own perspective, the way I've come to understand it, and it will help you to identify the fakers a lot better. So hopefully that is something that has helped you. And if you do like this video, please leave a like down below, subscribe to my channel if you want to support my work, and if you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.